come back and talk to you because you had some very, experienced and strong opinions about carbon sequestration and all that carbon credit stuff. And of course, you can't hang around in this space without running into a little bit of it.
Right.
And so we thought that we'd come back to the guy that's been here doing it a long time.
Sure.
So if you don't mind starting,
Yeah.
most people are just really new to this. Even the veterans are 10 years. You've been doing this and really in this field, at least relative to agriculture, for a long time. And if you could just give us a little bit of background on how you got into this and your backstory. I know it's on your website, but it's great stuff. And of course, you got the NASA logo in the background there. I appreciate that.
There we go. Yeah. And a guitar.
And a guitar.
And then there's my Guggenheim print. So we've even been we've been in the Guggenheim Museum in New York City pre-pandemic or during.
Well, I was going to
pandemic.
ask you that at the end, but why don't you go ahead and tell that story? Because I don't think Larissa and Melanie have heard it.
Are we in record now? So
Yep, okay. We are.
Sure. Well, we got asked to be involved with some landscape architecture. One of the top architects in the world, his name is Rem Koolhaas, and he's considered the modern Frank Lloyd Wright of architecture. And he's been an urban architect out of the Netherlands and also out of Harvard. And anyways, one of their associates came up and said, we want to look at the countryside, the rural landscape. And we've been concentrating so much on urban, and we want to look at rural and how do we redevelop the countryside. And so I was recommended to be talked to, and we got involved with his team. And so he's putting on this whole countryside exhibit in the Guggenheim Museum in the February of 2020, which was, guess what? A week before pandemic, right? So he also commissioned, or actually commissioned a work for us to say, I want to see satellite imagery from your perspective. So we took some high resolution satellite imagery and looked at some farmland. And we made it, if you can see there, kind of Andy Warhol's. We had 4 panels. And so he worked with me to help figure out how we're going to do this, and came up with this. So on the left side is the regular base map that you get from Google or Apple. The next one is the raw satellite image. The next one is an NDVI analysis. And the 4th panel is actually the vegetation analysis with vectorization of the actionable variable rate map to put in a tractor that you would change crop inputs like fertilizer, seed, or chemical. So we did it, and then they hung it up on the top floor of the Guggenheim, and it was 7 feet by 12 feet. And it hit, the picture went into Architectural Digest and all sorts of different architectural magazines around the world. So I got my 5 minutes of fame. It was there for about 2 weeks, and then the pandemic hit. They closed the Guggenheim for 6 months, and then they reopened it. So it got to hang in the Guggenheim for about 6 months. So
nice. That's exactly what every sustainability person's objective is to get their work hung in the Guggenheim, right?
Well, it's my little claim to fame. The one little thing was I tried to get the original print, and the museum operator said, no, we trash them all. And we put them in the garbage. And so I made arrangements to go pick it up. And here we had a snowstorm. And I was trying to figure out how to transport a 7 by 12 print in the back of my pickup truck box from North Dakota to New York City, or New York City to Fargo. And so we had a big storm, and we canceled it. So it is in the trash heaps of the New York garbage pit somewhere.
Wow.
But I do have the original file, and that is what we're deriving our prints from. So.
And so how did you to get back to how you got started. So how did Satshot come about, and how did you get into this business before anybody was really talking about it?
Well, the key thing is when you are desperate and you have to figure out how to make a living, your brain really becomes active. That's number one. So I went back. My wife and I went back to college in our mid 30s to come up with another life after 17 years of farming, because the 1980s were a difficult time in agriculture, and we were experiencing that. So in '92, we jumped ship, went back to school, dropped half of my farmland, went and landed in the first GIS class at North Dakota State University. And I've always been interested in imagery, as I am an airplane pilot. I got my license back in 1977, flew my fields that I was farming and found out they didn't look very good from the air. And I saw all these patterns in the fields. And then I dabbled. So I took a bunch of infrared film and never developed it, but it was still developed in my mind that there's variability from the air. And then I was always curious, so I contacted Spot Imagery back in 1987, the year after they launched their first satellite out of France, and talked to them a little bit, found out I really didn't know how to do anything about it. But when I went back to school in '93, I got into the geospatial business, and I found out that instead of going 6 years to get my master's, I found out that I could start a company with a business card. And so I did, because my kids wanted to go back to our hometown, because Fargo was way too big at about 70,000 people. And so they wanted to go back. And so I had to figure out how to create a business. So I created a geospatial business called Agri-Images with a GIS. Put my name on a business card, started attending conferences, and I was lucky enough to be one of the first ones in the business. So then you can tell it, you can learn by reading books, not have a degree. Now today you have to have a degree because it's a mature business, right? Mm-hmm. So now I have 29 years of experience. And agriculture business. So I created a company called Agri-Images, which had a product called Satshot, which is what we are today. And we started within 9 months. I got my first contract with American Crystal Sugar, the largest sugar beet producer in the world, or maybe not quite the world. 500,000 acres of sugar beets, and I happened to be in line in a grocery store heading back to my small town, and the guy came up behind me, a friend of mine, said, "So I hear you're starting a business." I said, "Yeah, what are you going to do?" "Oh, I'm going to look at satellite imagery from space and look at monitoring crops." "You know, you work at Crystal Sugar. Who should I talk to there?" "Well, that should be me," he said. So within 9 months, he gave me a $92,000 contract in 1995.
Wow.
So that's how I got started. That was my startup money. So
now you have to explain for the younger people who might be watching this or listening right now, what it was like to do that back then, because there was no internet and you couldn't just go online and pull satellite images, right? Didn't you put your own dishes in?
Well, that's later on. We have dishes with Planet Labs right now back in 2014 in my pasture in the middle of North Dakota, which is a unique story in itself. I got lots of stories, Tom, so, watch out here, okay?
All right.
Well, I had to contact Spot Image because I got my first $5,000 data buy from Crystal Sugar. And so we'd order a satellite image from Spot in Reston, Virginia, their US office, and they sent it out on a CD. And or I'm not sure if it was a CD or a DVD, and I think it was CDs. And we loaded it up and started looking at it and the raw imagery, and we started looking at fields. But that's how crude it was, just by CDs. Took a while. And so we did that for quite a while. In 1996, we developed our own piece of software that my nephew wrote to analyze a satellite image, little Windows program. And then we'd talk to farmer clients and ag consultant clients, and we distribute a CD that had an encryption code on it. And we had a little piece of software that only our software could open up that satellite image.
Okay.
And so we protected it. Okay. And then so we could go sell, okay, here's a township. We sold townships, 6 by 6 mile townships. And we said, okay, this is, I'm not trying to remember. I think we sold townships for $500 a crack or something like that. And then we go, how many townships in here? Well, we have 4 townships. So that was a couple grand. We sent them a CD, we gave them a piece of software. They could analyze it and see their fields. And they could export the data into a raw text form so they could put it into another software program. So that's how we started.
And was that what they were doing back then? What were they determining from the imagery itself, and what did they do with that information?
Well, what we were trying to do in 1996, we teamed up with North Dakota State University, and they did a research project. The reason Crystal Sugar was interested was because they had an incentive program to stop the farmers from just blanketing high levels of nitrogen, because that looks great on your field, right? But on sugar beets, if you put too much nitrogen on, you will create a lot of foliage, but the sugar beet will be small. So what are they in the business for? They are there to produce sugar. So they want a smaller beet. They don't want a lot of tonnage. They would rather have a high percentage sugar in a smaller beet. So we did research with NDSU to show that the satellite image could define the zones in the field where the heavy amounts of foliage were versus the smaller amounts of foliage. And so they use satellite imagery to tell farmers, drop your nitrogen application the year before on the fields that you're going to put beets, so that you do not put excessive nitrogen down, which creates expensive tonnage to process. We want smaller tonnage and higher sugar content. So that was the whole business model behind that.
So when did that change to, I think, you were taking that data and supplying it to the farmer so they could feed it into the John Deere? So what sort of decade was that?
Well, the precision ag movement started about 1995 officially, as that was the first precision ag conference. And there were a few companies out there that were creating controllers to put in your tractor to hook up to GPS, and then that would send the signal to a valve on your machine or a gate, open up and shut the gate, depending on what compound you were spreading or applying. And so we could send it a GPS location, a point, and say, okay, we only want to put 100 pounds on this point. We want to put 75 pounds on this point. And so our satellite imagery maps could be attributed to say to the controller, open the gate, lower the gate, open the valve, lower the valve, based on the vegetation productivity of that field within that zone. So we would make an image, a field map that had somewhere between 5 and 8 zones of different vegetation productivity, biomass. And then we would assign a rate to each of those. And so there were a number of companies creating these controllers to put in tractors or fertilizer spreaders. And then we came along and said, here's data to drive that in around 1995, 96, 97, around there.
And when did that really become sort of standard?
It became standard practice when the big companies started understanding the reality of it. We were kind of lone wolves with another company from about 95 till, well, that other company came after us, 98. But from 05 to 03, approximately, 04, we were pretty much alone in the world, except for maybe one other company out of France. And then the majors came in later 2000, started becoming more interested. It became standard practice now for the innovators. Not everybody does it. About 2012, 2013 it became very popular, and now it's becoming standard practice, although I would still say 50% of the people don't do it. So.
And is that 50% US or 50% worldwide?
It's definitely US. Worldwide, it's catching on quite a bit. It's US has become more dominated with corporate right now and big ag retail, while same with the European markets, and Australia, Brazil is starting to grab onto it. It's got variable levels of acceptance, could be down to 5% all the way up to 50%, depending on the country. But since 2014, really, or somewhere in there, all the tractors have controllers built into them and GPS built into them. So I know a lot of farmers that buy all the gadgets for their machines, but they don't do anything with them because they want resale value.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's there. If you got a lot of money in your pocket, you don't do much. And if you have too little money in your pocket, you don't do much. You got to get that sweet spot. So yeah. Environmentally, in my opinion, every acre should be variable rated with at least one crop input. To me, you should be able to do seed, chemical, fertilizer. And there's a lot of people doing it.
I don't remember the stats on it, but essentially you're part of the increase in agricultural productivity that's made the predictors of world hunger fail decade after decade after decade. They're continually forecasting that we're all going to run out of money and there just can't possibly be enough food, and yet we keep going. And I think, if I recall, we're actually producing more food with less acreage now than we did 10 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. The last year I farmed in 1994 with about half of my acreage. I'd gotten my dryland wheat yields in North Dakota, central North Dakota, up to 39 bushel proven yield across all acres. When I started farming in 78, my dad had a 17 bushel proven yield.
Wow. And
I went up 20 bushels in a period of, let's say, 15 years. Okay.
Wow.
Since 94 then, so we're back up 25 years now since that, we are pushing average yields that are, would say, another 20 bushels. We're at 60 bushels an acre.
Wow.
Maybe even a little higher than that. So just think about that. We from 1978 to present day, which is, 45 years, we have gone from, let's say a 20 bushel average to a 60 bushel average.
Yeah.
Now, people who think, is there another climb to 80 bushel? Yes, there is. You have to have weather events to help you, but the techniques, we have gone from, when I started farming, we were plowing every acre of land. I started minimum till and then no till before I quit. Now, almost, I would say 75% is no till.
Really?
And we are protecting our soils. Yes, we are using chemicals like Roundup. But if you didn't have that type of chemical, you would have bare soils, flying dirt all over the place. I have seen walls of wind that go up 1,000 feet in the air. Scarier than heck. Depression era. And that was in the 1980s, mind you. Wow. We don't ever want to see that again.
Yeah. Well, switching gears a little bit to in Melanie's conversations with these corporate entities, and they're all different kinds, right? And we're beginning to focus more on those that have some form of natural resource management issues in terms of the work they're doing. But carbon capture, carbon credits, carbon sequestration. I think we talked about that last time that we were on a call, and sort of like, where are people faking it? Where is it real? What's going on? We don't necessarily need to rehash all that stuff. You had some very pointed opinions about that world, but as I recall, you also were running your own carbon sequestration experiment on your farm. Do I remember that right?
Yeah, my wife, who has we've been 45 years this year, is been together. We have 100 acres left, 110 acres of the 1,500 acres I farmed. We have our farm sit in central North Dakota, and we still have a house there. We go back and forth. Of that 110 acres, we took 50 acres of pasture and wetlands and decided to partition that off in our minds. It's got 2 roads around it as an agrarian preserve, we call it. And this is how we did it. We did nothing. We just said, nature, take over this 50 acres. We also notched out 3 acres to put 2 $1 million satellite receiving stations from Planet Labs that we lease out to. We don't own the satellites dishes, they do. But we have this fiber optic connection. We have gigabit fiber in the middle of North Dakota. We're the best wired state in the world, or in the United States. And right up to my doorstep. So there's 2 $1 million receiving stations sitting there, grabbing images from satellites in this 50-acre preserve. Now, this 50-acre preserve has got about 10% wetland or water itself, 10% cattails, which is considered a wetland, and about 10 acres of wetlands, 10 acres of cattails, and about 30 acres of prairie.
Okay.
Now, we use that because I was flying all over with my business, is how do we just voluntarily, nobody's going to pay us for it because we didn't convert it, we sustained it. And this is where carbon capture, in my opinion, and what's going on, is we have to reward the people who sustain the environment. So right now, I am not available to get any dollars because we voluntarily have done this. It's just like when I no-tilled back in the early 90s and minimum tilled in the 80s, I cannot get any credit for that because I was an innovator. Someone that plowed their land up to today and now converted it to carbon sequestration by doing no-till gets paid.
Really? Okay.
So that's the rules. So I'm sitting with 50 acres of carbon. If you want to look at prairie, it's worth about 1.7 tons of carbon, tons per year. I would say my prairie is rather thick and luscious. So I would say it's maybe closer to 2 or 3 tons, but that's not in the rules, right?
Mm-hmm.
My cattails, and this is where people don't get it, is worth 15 tons an acre per year.
Really?
And nobody knows it. Now they do. Now I'm telling everybody.
Yeah, we're getting the word out.
There we go. Cattail, if you look it on Google, what is the carbon sequestration rate of cattails? 15 tons an acre. Now we have 10 acres of water to turn into algae in August. I'm trying to remember the number. It's 2.7 tons of carbon sequestration per acre per day.
Wow.
Nobody wants algae blooms in their water.
Yeah.
You know what the biggest carbon sequester is? Algae.
And how long does that last when those blooms occur? So you're not getting that all year long, but you're getting that for what, month and a half, 2 months in the summer?
Well, we're in North Dakota, so about 3 months, we have active, really heavy growth, and it really produces in July and August. But, cattails that's per year. So that'll be 15 tons total per year. algae is per day. Now, how does algae do? Well, the masses of algae, they turn into some algae bloom. And if you go is it up in Scotland, they have peat bogs. How are peat bogs done? Okay, it's algae, historic algae. And then they create this algae bloom, they sink to the bottom, they create peat. The peat, it fills up. And now you have a peat bog.
Mm-hmm.
So we sit here in North Dakota with this immense prairie wetlands area that is producing. So it's not just about sequestering carbon, it's also about emitting oxygen. Now, I'd rather emit oxygen more than sequester carbon because I want some oxygen to breathe.
Yeah.
Nobody's talking about oxygen. Everybody's talking about carbon. Well, you got to do both, but you got to monitor both, and you got to put a value to both.
So how does what you've got going compare to, somebody that takes 100 acres in the Amazon rainforest and packages it up and sells it into the carbon credit market?
Well, I would say those guys are really in trouble. If you listen to one of the news organizations a few months ago said that 85% of that carbon is worthless. It's not even captured.
Yeah, well, let's assume that we're talking about some of the good guys here that are doing it right.
Okay, I'll assume that, Tom. A tree compared to a wetland is minute compared to a wetland. You can see the statistics. Yes, a tree is a tree. I love trees. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
they're very slow growth. You can destroy a wetland and it'll come back 100% the following year, if not more. We actually had a drought 3 years ago, and my wetland was kind of reduced in half. Last year when we walked the wetland, it was so heavy. It was like because of the previous year's drought, it just like mushroomed 50% higher. It was up to the tops of our heads on the road. It's so massive. When I see I got trees too, old established trees, but to establish a tree is a long-term event. That's a long-term proposal. That tree is going to take 20 years to even get to vegetative level. While we have native prairies and grasslands and wetlands and marshes. Tom Marsh, hey, I like that. That can recover so fast. That is a much better, wise short-term solution. So we should be rewarding.
For a given 100 acres, then we should be focused first on wetlands in terms of this particular carbon and oxygen generation problem, not so much on planting trees. We should be planting cattails.
We should be, but a lot of people don't like cattails.
Yeah.
And, but I would say.
A lot of people like to breathe, though.
That's very true. Good point.
Yeah.
The talk about, we kind of tend to throw it off. It's not very important. You listen to about down in Louisiana where the marshes down there have been destroyed through development and water rising, and now they're trying to restore that wetland. I would say that is very positive to do that. But we tend, even in farming up here, we got an area northeast of where I farmed, that is called the heart of the prairie pothole region. And we see farmers, they're farming around the wetlands. It's become wetter and wetter up there. And so at the edge of a wetland, at the beginning of the good soil where you can grow the crop, is a salt ring. And these salt rings, they hover around the edges of the wetlands because farmers will dig them up and then try to plant there. And the salts are so high in the soil that it'll just destroy that buffer of about a couple 100 feet, 100 yards at times. Wow. But they'll do it the next year. They'll dig it up again, dig it up again, dig it up. It's like insanity. What's the definition of insanity? Is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, right?
Sure.
Paraphrasing that. Why don't we convincing them to let the cattails grow up on this fringe? Because cattails love salt. They will grow in salt. And so incentivize people. Some of these fields, half of the sections, half of the quarter sections are wetlands and half of it's farmland. So you got to drive this very wide machinery around, and it doesn't work.
So back to your point, there's no, in the incentives, there's no incentive for them, as you were saying before, for them to just let that happen.
It's all about change management, changing your management from point A to point B. And then you get incentivized for that. If you're already at point B, there's no incentive for you to get paid for that. What we're doing is completely voluntarily, Tom.
Yeah. But you're also saying that there should be. There should be an incentive for maintaining that and continuing it, not just changing from a bad practice to a good practice kind of thing, right?
You're right. I mean, an example is we had a project in North Dakota here called the Meadowlark Project. And it's about to improve habitat for meadowlarks and wild species and all this stuff. I called up the head guy a couple of years ago. I said, look, I'd like to be involved with this meadowlark project for our 50 acres of agrarian preserve. And we were talking and talking. And finally he said to me, Lanny, I can't help you. Why? Because you're doing everything right. So therefore you can't go into the program. Because you're doing everything right.
Yeah.
And so basically you have to do something wrong to be incentivized to change your practice, and then you will get paid. We all live on this planet. Why is that becoming the mantra for carbon sequestration?
Yeah. Well, that's got to be a takeaway from this conversation. So we have in our interviews, we highlight specific quotes and things to try and drive things. I'm thinking our first interviewee, Kristen Noth, has been involved with, government regulation creation and all that good stuff. She'd be someone we should talk to about that. Is there a place in a region in the world or a country where that in your opinion they've got the incentives right, or is everybody sort of chasing these problems and not there yet?
I think the latter statement is accurate. I don't think anybody's got it right, to tell you the truth. I suppose I would say that I'm close because we're doing this voluntarily, but we're not, we're doing it for our own sake, not anybody else's. When you start to me, the carbon market has gotten so full of hyperbole. And, I've heard statements from politicians that said there's a $40 trillion ESG market out there. Well, those numbers just make everybody's heads rattle, and everybody think, well, I want a piece of that. I think we're totally in the wild, wild west in the carbon market. I believe in the carbon market, but I believe it with structure, with rules and incentives, and reward the people that want to do this and know how to do this.
Right.
Don't penalize them. And, we have resources, in my opinion, right sitting in front of us. Again, the prairies, the wetlands, the trees, build on that. But the price of carbon right now, I was looking at the carbon markets just the other day. What is it? Climate-based market, or is it digital carbon or something like that? $1.52 a ton. And then Europe is at $88 a ton. Why the discrepancy here? You will not get any farmers, any landowners involved here in the United States if the carbon market is in that sub $10 range, even the sub 20. In my opinion, carbon needs to be worth $100 a ton. And until we can back that kind of value, nobody's going to move away from planting corn at $6, $7 a bushel at 200 bushel corn and replace it with a ton of carbon that's only worth $20.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to do that. So if you want landowner buy-in, you got to do something.
How much of that distortion do you think is from folks that are just greenwashing, cheating the system, marketing stuff that doesn't really work? And in follow-up to that, I mean, and work this into the answer, because I'm not exactly sure where to ask this question, but Mel had a question about your comment about oxygen and whether there's is there a way to monitor that, and should that be calculated into these equations separate from the carbon stuff or in conjunction with it?
Well, on the last point, yes, I believe that should be now. I mean, there's plenty of oxygen sensors and scientific technology to monitor oxygen levels, but I don't ever see that in the equation. And to me, it is about oxygen. I mean, if we have more oxygen, I would think, and I'm not a scientist on this, but prove me wrong. So if you have more oxygen content, you should be able to live with a little bit more carbon dioxide content, right? I would think that blend would.
Don't put me on the spot, Lanny. I'll let you be the non-scientist on that one, but it does intuitively make sense.
Right, right.
And,
I mean,
and relative to monitoring both, because I think we talked about this last time. How are the sensor technologies that are satellite based doing with respect to being able to help us with actually monitoring what's really going on with 1,000 acres, some remote location, and making sure that that's for real?
Well, what we do in our company is we monitor vegetation biomass density. And almost everybody uses an algorithm called Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is called an NDVI. Or you can do variations of the NDVI. You can do SAVI, Soil Adjusted Vegetation Index. You can do T-SAVI. You can do LAI, all these different indexes. But all they come back down to is the NDVI index basically shows a consistent biomass level that is normalized throughout the time period. So I can look at an NDVI image from this year and compare it to last year and see the relative change of biomass. Now, we're not detecting carbon, we're not detecting oxygen, we're not detecting any elements with that algorithm, but we are detecting biomass. And the general consensus is that the more biomass you have, the better it is, right? So in agriculture, the more vegetation you have, the more yield you're going to get. Now, there's sometimes that goes backwards, very little, but I want to grow. My job is to grow vegetation. And then my management skills are going to allow me to get that to yield, okay? But if I have no vegetation, I'm not going to get a yield. So it's the same way with carbon. If I'm going to take carbon out of the air, a plant absorbs carbon dioxide. All living plants absorb and eat off the carbon dioxide, or eat the carbon dioxide, and then through photosynthesis emits oxygen. So the more biomass I have, the more leaves, the more stomatas in the leaves, the more oxygen it's going to spit out, and the more carbon dioxide it's going to ingest. So that's all we do. Now, some of the new satellite sensors that are coming into play, call it hyperspectral. It's in its infancy. Very few satellites up there. People are starting to work on them. Some are claiming, oh, we got 40 bands, 100 bands. It takes the light spectrum and splits it up into like slices of bread, into big chunk of unsliced loaves, like what we do. And it says, okay, now we can detect methane. We can detect carbon dioxide. We can detect this element, this element. It's just like the James Webb Telescope is looking at planets and galaxies and looking at the spectral signature and saying, hey, this planet has oxygen on it.
Mhm.
So the hyperspectral satellites, once they become scalable in the next 5 to 10 years, and that's going to take that long to get it scalable, we're going to be able to detect more minute elements that are on the land, on the vegetative crop. So hopefully we can measure that better and put targeted values to those different elements. Maybe it won't be a carbon market. Maybe it'll be an oxygen market. Maybe right now it's gearing up to be a methane market. Everybody wants to detect methane and try stop the leakage of methane, whether it's an oil well, whether it's a processing facility, whether it's a field, a pipeline.
Is the leaving the field fallow or doing what you're doing with that 100 acres, is that helping the equation because that biomass that you've measured is decomposing and ending up back, that carbon's ending up back in the soil, not being harvested and shipped off someplace? Is that why that's different?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we got to remember that when biomass breaks down, it also pushes out methane. Okay, it's going to have going through a decomposition process, but the majority of it's going to go into the soil, and I'm sure there's different disagreements about how much of where it absorbs in. And then there are certain plants, because of their makeup, they will bring, so we're talking about carbon sequestration of getting that carbon back into the soil. So certain plants' roots will sequester more carbon, like a perennial tall grass prairie. The roots are so massive underneath the prairie, and it's a very good carbon sequestration root. While corn is a lot of on the top foot or something, top 6 inches. And so that carbon, most of the biomass is sitting above the ground, and that's going to get chewed up with a harvester, take the corn seed away from it, and then it's going to lay on top. And if we're in a no-till environment, it's going to actually start emitting methane, right? So we want to get the proper plants that'll ingest the methane in the soil and lock it up like a safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So each species of plant has different efficiencies of sequestering carbon.
Mm-hmm. How much, changing gears a little bit, this has been really great. I think one of the things that you said when we had talked last time was the difference, and I think you just repeated again, I'm just sort of verifying that I'm listening, is it's one thing to sort of measure biomass and use the tools that are available to give you an indication of what happens year after year, but that is not directly measuring how much carbon's in the soil. That technology is not available, at least from space anyway. You have to go on the ground and do that, right?
Right.
And so for a company, and I think we were talking about one of our potential clients at the time, that says, hey, I got an agricultural producer in Pakistan, and they've agreed to follow these practices that are going to be better for the soil. They can't make sure that that's happening from the satellite, but they could look at the trends of what's going on that piece of land and see what the differences are, see if they're being managed. And they would just have to go back there to measure the actual carbon in the soil to see if it's doing any good. Is that a kind of a fair?
That's a fair explanation of it. Let me explain this. Okay, so there's a lot of companies that say, oh, we are, and it's very popular right now for companies that we can measure your carbon from space. And I really chuckle at that one. That's some of the hyperbole that's out there. Is in order to measure that carbon, you have to go take a soil test.
Right.
Now, I can, in my agrarian preserve of 50 acres, each year that number changes in that field or in that area. It changes by the biomass density. So I can say, okay, this year it's 10 acres of water, 10 acres of cattails, 25 acres of, or 30 acres of pasture. Then the year before it was maybe difference of a few acres on each one of them. So I'm a strong believer in, you got all these different environmental zones in a field or in a wetland or in a tree forest or whatever that are producing more tons of or sequestering more tons of carbon, creating more oxygen than other parts of that field. We tend to just say, oh, here's your boundary. We're just going to give you an average across the whole thing. I totally disagree with that. There's enough variability within a parcel, within a field, within a boundary that has different rates of sequestration and different rates of oxygen. So let's measure that. So that is what a satellite company can do like us. Mm-hmm. We can define you the acres. Now, well, how do we measure that? You got to send out someone with a soil test probe, and we'll measure the organic matter and what other variables in that soil. Stick a probe in the ground, 6 inches, a foot, 2 feet down, whatever, and measure it, bring it back to a lab. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, oh, we can just take an average sample. Baloney. You cannot do that. There's too much variability within that field. I can come up and put a probe in, and that might be 5-6% organic matter, and I can go to the top of a hill and find 1% organic matter. You cannot blanket apply one rate across that field. So the imagery biomass readings using tools like an NDVI can determine you have so many acres of this like biomass, take a soil test probe there. Calculate the acres, these are many tons you have. Over here, you have this zone. Take soil, representative soil tests, break your areas up into 5 zones, maybe 10 zones from a satellite. We measure the X and Y, and then we probe and test for the Z of what the quantity is, if that makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense. And so you're essentially building a model for the topography and the types of soil and terrain and cattails and wetlands and whatever, and then you sample in specific spots and extrapolate from there. But you're not taking the bottom of the hill and the top of the hill in the same area. You're boundary.
Exactly.
Right? So, yeah, no, that's.
And also, it isn't just about testing the soil for carbon. That's the main thing that everybody's looking at. Again, the emission of oxygen. What is the amount? And we can calculate biomass above ground. And I'm sure someone very intelligent can come up with an oxygen reading that corn emits this much oxygen per this vegetative index value. Nobody's talking about emitting oxygen.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of totally a missing point of
So I know we've taken a lot of time. I have two questions, maybe more than that, maybe less. I'm not sure. So where would you go to get the sort of ground truth about this topic, as particularly as it relates to agriculture and or specifically agriculture in the United States, if you want to define it that way? Where's the center of excellence for this, as opposed to the people that are, sort of posers? I mean, is it North Dakota State? Where would you go if you want to go? All right, I want to know the latest best practices research. Who do I go talk to?
Well, United States is a very valuable soil institutes or soil labs in land-grant universities. North Dakota State, which I'm only sitting 1 mile away from in Fargo, North Dakota, is one of the top 5 soil departments in the United States. And very reputable people there. You could go to Illinois, you can go to Iowa, there is such a wealth of knowledge of soil science in major universities here. And you have to be looking at them. I have gone to them and I've asked them, so tell me, how can we get involved with soil carbon? We did soil carbon monitoring back in 2009 with Canada, with the Alberta Carbon Exchange. It all fell apart because all the money, there was no backing. Today is different.
Mhm.
Same, it's going on again, but it's not being backed by the government again. So I'd go back to the soil sciences departments of the major universities and talk to them. This is not about a new widget or gadget that says I can see this. Now there's some great technology that's coming out, but it had better be backed with solid soil science.
Yeah, and that's
we have the
really
best
why,
soil science in the world here in the
yeah,
United States.
why I asked the question. Is there anyone in that space or just in this area, in this field in general, that you'd recommend us for an interview?
Dave Franzen out of North Dakota State is someone who's a friend of mine, and he's very, he's very reputable in this department. So
Dave Franzen, is that
Dave
what?
Franzen, Franzen, and he would put you in touch with the proper people if it's not. He's the head of the department.
That's cool. And two left. One, is there anything that we can do as part of this interview or as part of what we're doing at Bintel to help Satshot and the kinds of things that you're trying to do or your son's trying to do?
Well, just getting the word out here. I mean, we've been in the business with using remote sensing to look at land. I'm not a remote sensing scientist. I'm a farmer first and learned remote sensing last. And so to learn about agriculture and agronomy, you have to, it's like a sixth sense. So I see a lot of remote sensors out there that do not understand the agronomic principles of how vegetation grows and works. And so I bring in that expertise that brings those combinations together. And I love what you're doing with getting the message out, because back to a former question you had a few minutes ago about, what is going on with the corporate carbon sequestration. I would call it hyperbole. It's going on where there's companies that are very much emitters of carbon dioxide, and they have major brand name recognition, and they need to impress on their public that we are doing good to the environment. So they buy carbon credits, which fuels the value of carbon. At the same time, they are investing in carbon that maybe isn't doing a lot. It looks like they show it on their website that we are environmentally progressive. And the actual numbers of carbon acres, which now there's a lot of companies that are being called on that, the quality of the carbon that they're buying is not equal to the amount of money that they are putting in. So by putting that, we're involved with so many acres of carbon sequestration in the middle of Brazil, and here's our report. This helps their stock market value.
Right.
And this is where, now I know that's an incentive, but there's a disconnect here. It's like we can pay to play. And if we're going to improve the health of our world, we have to monitor it or else we can't measure it. That's an old saying out there. We have to monitor it. And we have to monitor it well. We have to monitor it sensibly and ethically. And right now, the carbon market, which I really wanted to succeed, I'm afraid it might be very difficult to sustain it.
So that's a perfect segue to my final question, which will make Melanie and Larissa laugh. Are you an optimist or a pessimist about the future?
If I wasn't an optimist, I wouldn't be doing this kind of business.
Yeah.
I've been an entrepreneur for my whole life, except for 2 months of my life where I got a check.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so being an entrepreneur and owning your own business, whether it was in agriculture, farming, or whether developing a complete new company with no market, no product, no customers, I have to be an eternal optimist.
You're preaching to the choir in that one. And
And
and Melly and I never, and the rest of my clan, they have never related their last name to a better carbon sequestration than the average, tree. So go Marsh team. Anyway, that's a perfect answer. Larissa, Melanie, anything? I know we went on for longer than you wanted us to, but any final questions or comments?
No, Lanny, thank you so much. I'm super interested in what you mentioned about oxygen and just got me thinking about a bunch of things and conversations. So that was something that I might ask you to expand on in the future. And no, this has been great.
well, cool. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have something, Larissa?
Um, can you hear me? I
Yep.
was just gonna say thank you. This was really interesting to me as well. I grew up in Iowa, so I have a lot of family that are farmers, and so this was very eye-opening and very interesting, and I would love to know the things that they're doing on their farms too. So thank you for sharing this and taking the time to meet with us.
Well, I appreciate it a lot. Let me close you with a image here. I'm going to zoom into my Guggenheim print. So I don't know if you can see this yet. There we go.
Yeah.
Now you see that this is eastern North Dakota, and can you see the lines in there? Can you see the different colors and the vector lines around these zones?
Mhm.
That's the variability of a field. So we know that that field has all sorts of minor areas, minor habitats that have different vegetation productivities within that field. So I just wanted to give you a graphic representation of kind of what I'm talking about. There's nothing solid, nothing equal in the landscape. The only thing that's square in a field is Thomas Jefferson's public land survey that he implemented across the whole West and Midwest, except for the 13 colonies, which they were developed before Thomas Jefferson, which is, he's an idol of mine, but he kind of squared us all off and created all sorts of environmental impact, and now we're trying to manage it. So we need to do a better job of managing our resources.
All right. Well, we'll take that message and push it out as hard as we can. This has been great. We'll be back in touch. I know we have the Eagle County project that you're aware of. We're moving along, so we'll have a platform to demonstrate to you, and I know you've got yours, and we can compare notes and see, where this thing could go, how we can accelerate all this. But thanks much, man. That was great. I love the fact that you got that picture in the background because somewhere there was a picture of that Guggenheim exhibit too that I saw when we talked a long time ago.
There's all sorts of magazine articles and of it. So it was a very much of an honor to have that. That was pretty cool.
Oh, sure.
For me and my wife.
We enjoy interviewing famous people. So
one tidbit about that Guggenheim print, just the last thing. When I finished working on that, we have a little app from Satshot called Land Scout that's on our phone and on our my iPad, our iPads. We can go out in the field and do it, and you can process satellite imagery on that. I found the best quality I got was to analyze it on my phone. So when I analyzed it in squares. So there's about 30 some squares, 40 some squares. I analyzed that print on little squares on my phone watching a movie on my couch.
Okay, well, now you got one more question. Next interview, you're gonna have to play a riff on your guitar or a song or something back there. You can't have those things as props, That's just not,
No, I
that's
got
just
too
not
many
authentic.
guitars. I just
There
got a
you
new
go.
one here a couple days ago, and we got our blue. I'm with about 30 other people around Fargo area. We're in some bluegrass jam session, so I'm hosting the jam in my office shop here tonight. So
geez.
if you can
Okay.
make it here by 7 o'clock, you can surely whoever's got a guitar, chip on in. So
Very cool. All right, listen, we'll let you go. Get your fingers warmed up and get ready to go for the evening. But this has been great. Thank you, Lanny.
thanks all. Thanks, Marcia.
Thanks so much, Lanny.
Thank you. Bye-bye.